Good evening and welcome to another backstory, part of the Bendigo Writers Festival of 2020. Well, once again, we're online, which seems to work very well. And I'd like to welcome today Dennis Glover. Good evening, Dennis. And where do we find you this evening?
Good evening, Steve. Lovely to be with you. I'm in sunny South Melbourne, not far from the beach, where I'll probably be going after this festival.
Oh, what a joy. Anyway, I'm not quite there, but we're both happy where we are, which is good. Now, we've come to talk about Factory 19, but I don't think we can, which is your second novel, but I don't think we can really go there without talking about The Last Man in Europe, because they are intertwined, I think. So perhaps if you could sort of tell me about The Last Man in Europe, and we'll go from there, I think. How did you come to write The Last Man in Europe?
Well, for people who don't know, The Last Man in Europe it dramatises the story of how George Orwell came to write 1984. And it's something that has fascinated me my whole life. I actually had to read Orwell 3 times when I was at high school, because we did it in the 3rd form, and then we did it again in the 5th form, and then I changed schools and we did it in the 6th form. So by the time I finished school, I could just about recite it from memory. So it's had this sort of amazing effect on me. And when I went to university, I became, it was Orwell's political stance that really gave me my political direction. And so writing a book about Orwell has sort of been inside me for a long time. And it was only after many years spent on the political barricades that I could find time to do it. It's a great story about the struggle to write 1984, which of course Orwell has to do against the ticking clock, because he has tuberculosis and has it bad and hasn't long to live, and he has to finish it before his final due date, let's say.
So he was fully aware that his time was limited, was he? Do you think that added a certain darkness to 1984? It's a pretty well-known dark book, isn't it? Really, it's not a joyful book. Let's put it that way.
Yeah. Well. Like all people with fathers who've been sick, you'll know that they deny it. They're totally in denial for a long time, but sort of know in the end that things are catching up with them. And Orwell is very much like that. And I think there's absolutely no doubt in my mind that it contributed to the darkness of the novel. I mean, for instance, in my novel, I recount the scenes of where Orwell is having his shocking pre-chemical treatment for tuberculosis, where he's strapped to a bed and has massive tubes inserted down his throat and huge needles stuck into his stomach to blow up parts of his body to repress his lungs and so forth. Collapse theory, they called it, lung collapse theory. And it bears an uncanny resemblance to the torture scenes in Room 101. And I think that it's undeniable that that the bleakness of his life contributed to the bleakness of Winston Smith's life at the end of 1984.
So you say you read the book 3 times.
Yeah.
So you knew it pretty well.
Yeah,
What did you think of it when you first picked it up? Was it you had to read it for study, or was there an enjoyment that you gained from it?
Well, I had to read it for study, but I think it was probably the first time in my life that a book really gripped me, as it would do, for a kid in year 9. And there's something about that. I remember at the time I was just living with my father, who was a factory worker in Doveton, and I spent a lot of time on my own because my father was out quite a lot. And I can remember reading it and rereading it, listening, to music of that time. And I have all these sort of associations, sort of the dark associations. In fact, that when I read 1984, the music that's going through my head is that 1977 War of the Worlds. Remember that?
Mm-hmm. Jeff Wynne, wasn't it?
Jeff Wynne's War of the Worlds,
yeah.
With all that music about the apocalypse and so forth. So that's what I hear, when I read 1984. It's got a soundtrack in my head.
Yeah, it's a pretty impressive book. So how did you sort of position yourself to to sort of write a book about how he wrote that? Is it researchable, or is it it's your idea? Is it based on fact, or
Well,
do you...
Totally based on fact. What happened was I was going to write. I was thinking of writing a book, a novel similar to Orwell's, and I thought I should go through it again. And then, me being me, I decided to get out the 20 volumes of Orwell's collected works and read them. And that took me some time. I mean, here are a couple of them now, pretty big, weighty tomes. There's 20 of those. And by the time I read them and then read parts of them again, I sort of intuited how Orwell wrote and how he thought, and sort of worked my way into the time period. And I was setting out to write a non-fiction book, a short non-fiction book called The Intellectual Origins of 1984, because I'd figured out how Orwell himself, where all the ideas for it had come from. I sat down and I wrote about a third of the book. And then I thought, wow, this is a great human story. Orwell's a struggler, going nowhere, with no direction. He meets a girl, falls in love. To marry her, he accepts a commission to go to Wigan to write about the unemployed miners and factory workers during the Great Depression. This turns him into a socialist. Being a socialist leads him on to Spain, where he's shot at by the fascists and the communists, which turns him into a particular, a singular sort of writer with a political vision all of his own. And then he has to struggle through the war. And then right at the end of the war, just as he's thinking, I have to write my great totalitarian novel, his wife dies, and her last parting note says, stop wasting your time in journalism, go to Jura and write your great book. And it occurred to me when I read that this had to be a human story, because the motivations for Orwell weren't just intellectual. And there's lots of philosophers and others who read too much into Orwell, but he was just he was a journalist. He wasn't a professor of philosophy, and his motivations were very human. And I guess for all of us, if your wife or your husband or partner said to you as their last dying wish to go off and do something important with your life, well, you'd do it, wouldn't you? And I think that was an important part of Orwell's story.
Well, I end up doing exactly what my wife tells me to do now. So surely, if it was written down, I'd feel honor bound to do it. Well, he's always been an interesting character, and he does come up often in, and I wonder how many people have actually read the book rather than just referring to it. It intimately, and his work intimately, and is he sort of misinterpreted and misquoted often in life, do you think, or do people just get the vague idea of what 1984 about?
Look, I think a lot of people obviously would speak about it from a degree of ignorance or skim reading or whatever, but the thing about 1984 is that it's one of the most read novels in the world, and one of the most formative novels in the Western world. Almost every school child in English-speaking countries is forced to read it at some time whilst they're at school. I did it 3 times. My own two teenage sons, both had to do it at school and Animal Farm. And so just about every person who's got past 15 and stayed at school has read 1984. So if any novel is going to have a dramatic effect on the world, it's going to be that one. And I think what 1984 has done is it's given us a framework to interpret the world. I mean, think of Donald Trump and all of his claims about fake news, and his initial claims that, despite the fact of a photograph showing hardly anyone at his inauguration, he said it was the biggest inauguration in history and so forth. We're interpreting Donald Trump through the eyes or through the lens that George Orwell created. And I think that can't be underestimated.
It always struck me, actually a long time into my career as a sub-editor, that in papers you produce a newspaper and it sits in the library and it stays there. But nowadays, and this was something obviously that George Orwell wasn't fan of, his main character is a sub-editor, isn't he? And he rewrites news. And I'm thinking that nowadays you could do that just by going to the digital platform and changing it. So George Orwell, without even knowing about the joys of the internet and files, has got it spot on. And how news can be changed and stored to suit the government of the time. And it's quite frightening how spot on he was. Where do you think he had that foresight? Where did that come from, do you think?
Well, it came from Spain, actually. When he was in Spain, he recounts in Homage to Catalonia of reading newspaper accounts of battles that he himself had participated in, or supposedly participated in, which had never in fact happened. You know, grand battles with tanks attacking and cavalry and so forth, which were just really one or two people with rifles sniping at each other. So he knew that politicians manipulated the truth and in fact invented it and then rewrote it after the fact in order to suit themselves. And if he'd been around today to have a technology available which enables this to be done seamlessly, well, you know, he wouldn't be surprised at all.
It wouldn't be surprised, and I think a lot of people are claiming it, maybe more correctly than others, but it's certainly being claimed, and I can certainly believe it. The people of the future may have this news of nowadays changed altogether. Yeah. So is it, you actually, I've noticed you've written a foreword to the book. Are you now considered, with probably good reason, one of the foremost experts on the work of George Orwell?
Well, look, I'm a member of the Orwell Society, which means I get to sort of hang out online and occasionally in Europe and so forth with some of those experts. And having written this book, I think I know a lot about it. There are other people who have phenomenal knowledge of the inside outs of George Orwell's life, and there's many great biographers around. But everybody can find something. So when I was researching this book, and this is, here's an example of serendipity that you can come across when you're doing research on a book. I was in Shiplake, which is the town in Henley-on-Thames, just next to Henley-on-Thames, where Orwell grew up, looking at the golden country, because this is the golden country of the novel 1984, Winston's longed-for paradise. This is the place of Orwell's youth, and I've been there several times. I went into the Oxfam shop, where they have a charity bookshop in the town, because I was waiting for someone to turn up at the pub. He didn't come, so I went to the bookshop, and I pulled off the shelves a first edition copy of 1984 and got it for £2. Oh. And anyway, the woman who sold it to me just took one look at it and said, "Naughty boy, like you've really gotten away with this one." And I said, "Yep, I sure have." And anyway, I opened it up and I found it was the second impression of the first edition. Okay. And in the second impression, there's a change in the novel, because those of you who read it you probably read it at school, in the old Penguin edition, and it's near the end, it's got Winston writes in the dust on the table, 2 + 2 =. Well, in the original edition, it's 2 + 2 = 5. And in the Penguin edition, the 5 has disappeared. And that was taken, this one without the 5 was taken as the standard text for so long. And what I discovered was that it hadn't dropped out later on in a resetting of the edition. It had dropped out whilst Orwell was still alive and had been knocked out mechanically by a printer. So what we found is that the change was made to the book when Orwell was still alive. What's the importance of this? Well, if Winston Smith writes 2 + 2 =, he leaves it open that he can still defy the thought police. There's still hope. But if he writes 2 + 2 = 5, he's given in intellectually.
He's gone over.
So it could be finding out this. Well, I don't know how it happened, but the fact that it happened whilst Orwell was still alive, and whilst he was saying that he was dissatisfied with the ending of the book and he rather made it too gloomy, it opens a possibility that he himself had amended it in the second impression to make it a less gloomy book and more full of hope that we can defeat totalitarianism. And I think there's something, you can't prove this, it's just a theory, but it just shows, but I think it fits more in the character of Orwell, who's got this reputation of being a gloomy figure. They called him the wintry conscience of the nation. But when you read through the 20 volumes like I have, he's actually an optimistic utopian socialist type character, you know. So I think that it's more in line with maybe what he hoped he would have done.
That's one of the most stunning ways, if you think about that, spins the entire end of a book
Yeah.
by one letter, one numeral.
Yeah.
It's quite stunning to even consider that now. That's pretty
It's
impressive.
amazing coincidence, and more delicious for the fact that it involves somebody making a physical alteration to a published work. Just like
Yes,
Ministry of Proof does. So
yeah. There's something. Well, I've certainly learned things already, but that's a most impressive one. So you're obviously a man who can write in the style and admires deeply the work of George Orwell. Was he a very famous man in his day? Was he sort of towards the end of his life? Would everyone know the name?
only at the end, you see, until then, he would have been well known in literary circles. He'd written a number of novels, all of which pretty much had bombed. He'd written some very some strong non-fiction works, the best of which is probably Homage to Catalonia, but that was remaindered after selling 500 copies. There were lots of books about Spain coming out at the time. And most of the rest of them went up in the Blitz when a publishing house's warehouse was hit in 1940. The Road to Wigan Pier was a big success. It became a Left Book Club edition and sold about 40,000 copies, although they were cheap, almost giveaway copies. No, he wasn't very well known until he wrote Animal Farm. And then Animal Farm became this surprise smash hit that got on the equivalent, you know, of Oprah Winfrey's book club in America. And for the first time in his life, made him famous and quite wealthy. So, but here's the problem. Here's the great tragedy of George Orwell. By the time he became famous and wealthy, he was living on a farmhouse in Jura, dying of tuberculosis. And it was the end of, it was austerity post-wartime Britain. There was nothing to spend your money on. And the tax man came in, was taking 90% of it. So he never got to enjoy fame or money. So it's a great tragedy, but it's also, I guess, you know, a big chin up for any writer out there who's feeling depressed because, you know, they haven't been a success.
But it
was a failure until right near the end.
But you could almost, by looking at his work, and I've only read 3, so I'm not at the level of you that's exactly how you, if you were writing the story of George Orwell, that's how you'd write it. That he had a rather quiet ending, and well, a sad ending in a way. It just that sort of oozes out of the books for me, and it's just, I might have it wrong, but that's what comes out for me. Now, we're talking now. I'm going to talk now about your latest book, Factory 19, which when I read that before I'd read all the information about you and knew it, and I tend to like to watch films and read books totally cold. I don't read some people read the back and see. I don't do that. And apart from the fact that this was due to, we were going to have this conversation, I thought, great, I just picked it up. And I was immediately hooked, and that's a good thing to say, because when you read books like at school and you don't necessarily want to read them, you think, oh, but this one definitely wasn't like that, because it caught me from the first point. Because, well, obviously we don't want to discuss. We can discuss it, but we don't want to talk about how it ends and begins and everything. But there are references to background and appendixes of something which is a novel, and that impressed me immediately. So you've got this in your mind, this whole world that wraps around the book, which is good, because it immediately makes you think it's true, even though it's set lightly in the future. I'm quite surprised you went so little in you set it sort of 2022 onwards, haven't you? Halfway through the book, I thought, hang on, this is someone who's thought, oh, a man in 1948 wrote forward to 1984. I'm going to write back to 1948. Is that how the structure came about? And perhaps you can tell us how you thought about the book.
Well, I've said it in 2024, and that was because in some ways I wanted it to be contemporary, because we live in a revolutionary world of technology, which is changing our lives every minute. It's never changed so fast in so many ways with digital technology and so forth. I wanted to be contemporary, and to be frank, I thought it might take some while for this book to come out. So I set it in a time where it would still be today. or only just a little in the future. I didn't want the technology to change so much, so I just sent it in 2024. Now, if you think about Orwell, if you look at the manuscript to 1984, you'll see that initially it was 1980. And you can see in the manuscript version, at various stages, Orwell gets different pens and strikes out and writes 1982/1984 because he wants it to be set 40 years in the future. So, you know, there's a parallel there. But I think that the 1948 thing, well, look, the novel set in 1948. A billionaire tries to create a world based around with a year zero of 1948. You have to live like it's 1948. And why did I pick that year? Well, for two reasons. The first is that's the year that mainframe computers broke out of the military-industrial complex and became commercialized, and the Rand Corporation was established. The computer which now dominates our life broke free at that stage and started to play havoc with the economy and change the way we live. So I wanted to go back just before that, a month before that happened. But the second thing is that writing The Last Man in Europe, which is set predominantly in 1948, the year that Orwell wrote most of 1984, I'd got to know the year, how people dressed, what they ate, how they thought and spoke, the world, how the world was going on around them, the products they produced, and so forth. And so it came naturally for me to use that knowledge to write a book set on that in that time.
Maybe if you could, obviously the book develops pretty quickly at the front, so you can perhaps explain the initial structure, so as a teaser perhaps, because I think you need to explain how the book's structured to start with and where it develops from there. So how would you describe it at the opening?
We start off with the narrator introducing himself and his backstory and how he got to this place, Factory 19. And it starts off that he was a guy called Paul Ritchie. He was a speechwriter who worked for Prime Minister X, whose name is suppressed for legal reasons. And as anybody who's worked as a speechwriter to a political leader will tell you, it's easy to have a nervous breakdown working from him because they're very demanding. And he has this spectacular nervous breakdown, which is brought on by the way that mobile telephones and the internet and email, constant pinging of social media drives him crazy and turns him into a work slave 24/7. And he basically has a nervous breakdown and is diagnosed with digital proximity anxiety, the world's first person to be diagnosed with this illness, which is smartphone shock. As soon as there's a digital product near him, he, hides under the bed like those shell-shocked soldiers from the First World War. So he's drawn into this world created by somebody who may be familiar to us. He's a billionaire who lives in Hobart and runs the world's most outrageous art gallery. He's made his money from gambling online. And this chap wakes up one day and decides he's had a gutful of the internet and what it's doing to our lives, distracting us, turning our children into automatons, looking at screens all the time, and destroying our working lives by using apps to create, the digital economy. Instead of having good jobs, we're driving Ubers and delivering meals and so forth. And so he decides that he's just going to switch off, he's going to defeat the internet by switching it off. So he creates a community built around how people used to live and work in 1948. And to do that, he takes a factory, which he brings brick by brick from Detroit, Michigan, where the car plants are all still there, but not working, and builds this factory in Hobart. And all of these people are drawn to it, and living life in 1948 begins once again. So that's how the novel is set.
But when you come, I'm quite amazed. So there's this big flood eventually of people who want to live this life, and the factory becomes populated. Do you think that would happen, or do you think there'd be enough people out there who's had enough of it all? Not that I'm questioning the book. I'm just wondering if you think that would
Well,
happen now.
of course, it's in some ways a fantasy. It's an Arcadia. It's an ideal world of the past, a golden age that he's trying to recreate. And of course, in real life, this will possibly never happen. But around the world now, there's a huge movement of people who dislike what's happening. Who opt out of social media, who opt out of digital technology. There are people, there are colonies of people, a bit like the Amish, who live without any of this sort of technology and live their lives as if the digital world had never been created. There's an artisanal movement, handicrafts movement and so forth. And I think there's a massive audience for this way of living that a lot of people would, want to be part of. It may not end up like Factory 19, which manages to challenge the dominance of, Microsoft and Apple and Amazon and so forth. But it may, I think a lot of people would be attracted to this vision of living without technology.
Yes, it's not a universal shift to 94. It's just one part of Hobart, isn't it? The whole idea of Factory 19, and it's a vision that seems to go quite well. So the factory turns out items of that era, and they become very popular. And I think you got a point there. But how do you think if someone was just producing those things now?
Here's the thing, that the modern shiny world that we live in is attractive in many ways. But think back to the past. Think of how beautiful the cars were. Think about food before fast food. A factory canteen giving you a beautiful, toad in the hole, and roast beef with Yorkshire pudding and so forth. All of that sort of thing. There was a texture to life that in some ways is superior. The beautiful clothes, the way suits were made of wool. Okay, they got hot, but there was a beautiful texture to them. There's something about that era of living with its beautiful objects like a Spitfire. How could you write a book about the 1940s without Spitfire in it? This beautiful technology that's actually very attractive. And in some ways, I'd argue superior to what we get today. I mean, what would you rather have, a vinyl long-playing record, which was invented in 1948, by the way, or something on Spotify? And the good thing about this era was not only were the objects beautiful, but they gave people work and gave people a higher standard of living. So, for instance, a play on Spotify, you might, if you have a successful song these days, millions of people will download it on Spotify, and you might get a check for $7 from Spotify at the end of the year. Back in the old days, though, you would sell 1 million EPs, and you'd be living in Toorak. So there you go. The past had something to it. The past employed people, gave them good jobs, that were unionised, that had good wages, that had a darts club, and a social club and bingo nights, and unions, and this whole world that sustained people socially as well as economically. Whereas today we're divided up into individuals, sliced and diced by pieces of technology to work in low-paid gig economy jobs.
Right, so it's certainly a fascinating concept. So you obviously love the era. So if a Factory 19 was up and running, you'd be moving there like a shot, I imagine.
I would, but here's the thing: I've already lived there. When I grew up in Doveton, my parents were factory workers. My mum worked in the Heinz plant along with my sisters, and I worked there, during the holidays. My dad was a leading hand in the General Motors plant in Dandenong, and we lived in a place called Doveton, which is a housing commission suburb created to give places to live for all the people who worked in the newly emerging factories that were built near Dandenong in the 1950s and 1960s. So Factory 19 existed. And then in the 1980s, the economic reformers came along, shut all the factories, and Doveton underwent 20 years of 20% mass unemployment. You know, and there are places like this all around the world: Detroit, Michigan, the Rust Belt states that Joe Biden just won back during the election, the north of England, where the Tories have built their blue wall of disaffected working class people lost to the Labour movement. These places existed. And so in some ways, Factory 19 is a political book, which says the reason why we have the political world that we have today is because we took away the basis of working class prosperity in these factory communities. And our hero, Dundas Fawcett, sets out to recreate it. He, in some way, if you like, he's Donald Trump of the left who really means it. You know, he says that he'll help create the world anew for the workers, and actually does it.
It's an amazing character. Where do you, DF, as Paul Ritchie calls him, and everybody calls him, where did you come up with the idea for this man who has so much money he can do what he wants with it? And he's not an unpleasant man either.
No, well, it seems that whenever anyone gets over about $5 billion, they set out with a scheme to change the world. Right? So you think of the Gateses and the Gates Foundations trying to eliminate polio and cholera and all sorts of diseases from the world. Elon Musk is building rockets to try and colonize the universe. And so Dundas Fawcett, I had to find a charismatic character who had the ability to change the world. And you know, there is a chap in Australia who's a little bit like Dundas Fawcett, who owns an art gallery in Hobart. And he sort of jumped out at me, and I think the idea came to me one evening when I was out at the pub actually with a former Premier of Tasmania, and he was telling me about Mona, and he said he wouldn't be surprised if one day David Walsh turned up and put a note on the door and said, "Thanks for enjoying my art, now piss off." And what would happen to the Tasmanian economy if that happened? You know, because in some ways, Walsh's brilliant Mona gallery has created modern Tasmania. It's made it a sort of a place where it's shiny and new and sexy and smart, and a lot of people from the world want to come and see. Celebrities come from all over the world. He's created the modern Tasmania. Well, what would happen if the art gallery was taken away and all the economy collapsed? What would they do? So anyway, I was just looking for a transformative character, and these days, the great, you know, that sort of that eccentric billionaire seems to be the sort of person who wants to change the world.
No, he does it very efficiently, and what struck me is where perhaps other billionaires don't do. He's sort of he's very happy to be making people happy, and I just don't think that would happen with some people. They're happy to be making the money. When this man Fawcett seems to be spending his money to make people happy, so it's a good move, and it makes the book all more enjoyable. It takes of course. It runs quite well for a little while, then you'd have to have something go adrift.
Well, you know, ever since Adam and Eve were in the Garden of Eden and the serpent and the apple came along, there's been the fall of human nature. And so whenever you try to create a utopian world, an Arcadian world, like the Garden of Eden, like Animal Farm, Orwell's great Animal Farm, the Russian Revolution, anything, it always seems to go awry because human nature being what it is. And of course, what happens in Factory 19 is that the attempt to hold people to the year 1948 starts to disintegrate slowly by degrees.
Well, we won't go into that.
We won't give
it's part, no, the book is well worth seeing that development happen. Now, you say you're sort of familiar with 1948 because you've done so much work there. So confronted with the time machine and giving up everything in this world, not that we know that time, would you be back there in the world of 1948, or you're quite happy where you are?
Flash, yeah, I go back in a flash. Not just because, you know, it would be interesting to see, you know, what it was really like to live then. But, you know, by training, I'm an historian. And I think when you really love history, you actually have to actually tell yourself that you prefer the past. You know, you actually have to love the past. A lot of people write history in order to condemn it. You know, it was horrible for all of these terrible reasons. I actually think that there are things about the past that were superior to today. As I was saying before, you know, the economy that gave working class people prosperity and created unions and so forth. You know, we didn't have Donald Trump in America in 1948, or in Britain or in Australia. There's a lot nostalgia, a longing for the past isn't necessarily just a hankering for ephemeral things. That the past is a repository of some good things. It's where our constitution comes from. It's where our democracy comes from. It's where our ideas about equality come from, and so forth. And so I think that, yeah, I'd love to go back, get in the time machine and go back and experience it firsthand.
Oh, that shows a real passion for the era, and it comes across in the book. So what I remember watching the film about the Tucker, the motor car, and
Yes.
and that's and it was nice to remember how good a film and how good that story was, and that is one of the cars that Factory 19 builds. Have you ever seen one of those cars? And it's quite hard you have to look it up if you don't know about it. It's a beautiful car.
Yes. Well, the thing about the Tucker, the reason why I chose the Tucker was that it was built in 1948. Tucker only built one sort of like run of them, one production run during 1948 itself, and then it stopped. So if you wanted a car that represented 1948, that Americans would understand, you had to choose the Tucker. But because it represented not only 1948, but the future, what the future looked like in 1948. But here, of course, the first Holdens came off the production line in 1948. So it was the era that, you know, the Australian car industry started to take off and all those manufacturing jobs were created. So, you know, manufacturing, steel production, cars, these are the things that sort of help make our country. And so they have a central role to play in my 1948 as well.
Yes, perhaps what we can touch on from the book is the Factory 19 is making 1948 products, and the rest of the world wants them.
Of course they do. Yeah.
So it's a very successful idea, isn't it? And the rest of the world wants them, and it's a fascinating idea, to be honest, because yes, people would want things that have been properly made and made by hand,
Yeah.
and so it's a great concept, and I love the whole idea of it.
Think about music. You know, we always go through eras where the 80s are back in fashion. You know? Yeah. Think about the New Romantics. You know, they were reviving the fashions of George in England. You know, in the late 1970s in England, which you probably remember. You might have worn some of those clothes.
No.
But you know, people often long to go back to the past and adopt the fashions and so forth. And you know, Dundas Fawcett takes it to the extreme.
And he has a good response. I think Paul Ritchie is obviously a bit of you in Paul Ritchie. You've been the speech writer, and you hinted that it was quite a stressful world. So are you Paul Ritchie?
Well, look, in some ways, look, at the start of the novel, there's on the day of Paul Ritchie's breakdown, he's shown to be waking up in a camp bed by his desk in Parliament House, where he's working for Prime Minister X, you know, the slave driver, Prime Minister X. And I'll tell you a story. When just after I'd finished working as the speechwriter to the leader of the opposition, I worked for several of them. There was a change of leadership in the opposition. I'm not going to give you names. Change of leadership in the opposition one day, and all of the staff who worked for the previous leader got so annoyed that at lunchtime, after the leadership challenge had succeeded, they all went off to the pub and got horribly drunk and came back after midnight to find their offices already occupied. And one of them, looking around, saw a rolled up mattress and blankets on the floor and said, "What the hell's that doing in my office?" Someone said, "When you work for X, you're expected to sleep over quite a lot in the office because there's always some work that has to be demanded at 6 a.m. and it's not worth going home." So, you know, this is the sort of the pressure cooker environment that the lead character, Paul Ritchie, walks into and ends up having this spectacular nervous breakdown.
So I'm not going to ask for examples, but the revelations of what goes on in Parliament, did you have any surprises when those revelations were released in the Four Corners programme about the mistreatment?
No, it's an incredible, being a political staffer is you know, people hate political staffers, you know, probably for good reasons. You know, they distrust them, they think they're undermining our democracy, telling our elected politicians what to do, using polls and so forth. And there's some truth in that. But they're incredibly hard-driven people and hard-headed people. And to survive in those jobs, you have to be tough. So I was thinking myself when watching that Four Corners program that involved women getting, you know, falling afoul of stress in the office and so forth. I can recall sitting in front of one political leader just being incredibly ranted at. You know, like we used to call ourselves his anger sponge. You know, it was our to go and soak up his anger so that he could get it out of his system and go and perform. And, you know, you just had to be tough to survive. And no one, I survived in those jobs for about 10 years. No one survives much longer. In fact, they're probably doing you a favour to sack you at the end of it, because there's a world outside the crazy world of 24-hour, 24/7 politics.
And so very much if the person you're working for loses their job for something they've done, you lose your job too. So there's a...
Yeah, if you take the bullet with the boss.
Yeah, it's a moving feast of employment, I would say.
Yeah.
Now I know Factory 19's in its early days. You've got a big cycle to go. Have you got a next work in the pipeline?
Well, I have. You know, I have two ideas, and I can't decide which one to go with. I've started a novel which involves retelling the story of Scott of the Antarctic from the point of view of his meteorologist who got the weather wrong, and as a result they died. And so it's obviously a novel about climate change, with climate change sort of thing to it. And I have, but in the meantime, I decided I would write a small, a short non-fiction book, much as George Orwell might have done, you know, between his novels, he wrote these non-fiction books. And I decided to, so I started writing that. It's all about the lessons from the 20s and 30s about the rise of fascism during the Great Depression and how it could all happen again. And what I've found in researching it, much as I did with The Last Man in Europe, is that there are great human stories in this about what happened to all of these characters who gave us the warnings, and they all knew each other. So, for instance, Siegfried Sassoon knew John Maynard Keynes, and he knew Winston Churchill, and he knew Isherwood and Auden, who went to Berlin and saw the rise of fascism, and then wrote this great poetry when the Second World War started. So, what I've done is I've stupidly deflected myself from writing a very short, quick non-fiction book into writing another book about intellectuals and how they've tried to warn people about the coming of the Second World War. So anyway, that's how books get created.
Well, of course, yeah. You don't come up with the whole idea straight at once, I imagine.
No, they evolve. You know, books evolve like that. You have an idea, and one thing comes from it. So, for instance, Factory 19 came from another sort of a science fiction novel that I was writing, where people who survived a Holocaust were as a history department, which were trying to live before the computer came. And this was only live life as it was before the computer. And this was only a page or two of that previous novel. And that, then I grabbed the kernel of that and turned it into Dundas Force and Factory 19. So that's how books.
Yeah, it's something that people often ask how a book comes about, but I can see that it's just kernels and kernels that join up to become many other things. Well, it's not up to me to invite you, but are you planning on visiting the Writers' Festival next year? It's not far for you to come if it happens.
I've been before.
Bendigo.
I've been a couple of times before, and it's always terrific, fun event, and I'd love to come. In fact, you know, it's one of the great sadnesses of having a book come out this year, because one of the joys of writing a book is getting to go to all of the festivals, and meet everyone and say hello to all the people buying your book, and I can't do it. I'm doing it by Zoom, which is good, but isn't quite the same.
Yes,
and I'd love to do it. Yeah,
I'd agree with it. Anyway, I'm sure that can happen. Not that, as I say, it's anything to do with me. So anyway, Dennis Glover, thanks very much for having a chat. A very, very low level chat, because we can't go much deeper because people need to read the book for themselves. But Dennis Glover, thanks very much for talking to us tonight.
My pleasure. Thanks so much.